The Three Little Birds. About 1,000 or more years ago, there were in this country nothing but small kings, and one of them who lived on the Quarterberg was very fond of hunting. Once on a time, when he was riding forth from his castle with his huntsmen, 3 girls were watching their cows upon the mountain, and when they saw the king with all his followers, the eldest girl pointed to him and called to the 2 other girls, "If I do not get that one, I will have none." Then the second girl answered from the other side of the hill, and pointed to the one who was on the king's right hand. "Hilloa, Hilloa, if I do not get him, I will have no one." These, however, were the 2 ministers. The king heard all this, and when he had come back from the chase, he caused the 3 girls to be brought to him, and asked them what they had said yesterday on the mountain. This they would not tell him, so the king asked the eldest if she really would take him for her husband. Then she said yes, and the 2 ministers married the 2 sisters, for they were all 3 fair and beautiful of face, especially the queen, who had hair like flax. But the 2 sisters had no children, and once when the king was obliged to go from home, he invited them to come to the queen in order to cheer her, for she was about to bear a child. She had a little boy who brought a bright red star onto the world with him. Then the 2 sisters said to each other that they would throw the beautiful boy into the water. When they had thrown him in, I believe it was into the Weiser, a little bird flew up into the air, which sang, "To thy death art thou sped, until God's word be said. In the white lily bloom, brave boy, is thy tomb." When the 2 heard that, they were frightened to death and ran away in great haste. When the king came home, they told him that the queen had been delivered of a dog. Then the king said, "What God does is well done." But a fisherman who dwelt near the water fished the little boy out again, while he was still alive, and as his wife had no children, they reared him. When a year had gone by, the king again went away, and the queen had another little boy, whom the false sisters likewise took and threw into the water. Then up flew a little bird again, and sang, "To thy death art thou sped, until God's word be said. In the white lily bloom, brave boy, is thy tomb." And when the king came back, they told him that the queen had once more given birth to a dog, and he again said, "What God does is well done." The fisherman, however, fished this one also out of the water and reared him. Then the king again journeyed forth, and the queen had a little girl, whom also the false sisters threw into the water. Then again a little bird flew up on high and sang, "To thy death art thou sped, until God's word be said. In the white lily bloom, bonny girl, is thy tomb." And when the king came home, they told him that the queen had been delivered of a cat. Then the king grew angry and ordered his wife to be cast into prison, and therein was she shut up for many long years. In the meantime, the children had grown up. Then eldest once went out with some other boys to fish, but the other boys would not have him with them, and said, "Go thy way, foundling." Hereupon he was much troubled, and asked the old fisherman if that was true. The fisherman told him that once when he was fishing, he had drawn him out of the water. So the boy said he would go forth and seek his father. The fisherman, however, entreated him to stay, but he would not let himself be hindered, and at last the fisherman consented. Then the boy went on his way and walked for many days, and at last he came to a great piece of water, by the side of which stood an old woman fishing. "Good day, mother," said the boy. "Many thanks," said she. "Thou wilt fish long enough before thou catchest anything, and thou wilt seek long enough before thou findest thy father. How wilt thou get over the water?" said the woman. "God knows." Then the old woman took him up on her back and carried him through it, and he sought for a long time, but could not find his father. When a year had gone by, the second boy set out to seek his brother. He came to the water, and all fared with him just as with his brother. And now there was no one at home but the daughter, and she mourned for her brothers so much that at last she also begged the fisherman to let her set forth, for she wished to go in search of her brothers. Then she likewise came to the great piece of water, and she said to the old woman, "Good day, mother." "Many thanks," replied the old woman. "May God help you with your fishing," said the maiden. When the old woman heard that, she became quite friendly, and carried her over the water, gave her a wand, and said to her, "Go, my daughter, ever onwards by this road, and when you come to a great black dog, you must pass it silently and boldly, without either laughing or looking at it. Then you will come to a great high castle, on the threshold of which you must let the wand fall, and go straight through the castle and out again on the other side. There you will see an old fountain, out of which a large tree has grown, whereon hangs a bird in a cage which you must take down. Take likewise a glass of water out of the fountain, and with these two things go back by the same way. Pick up the wand again from the threshold, and take it with you. And when you again pass by the dog, strike him in the face with it, but be sure that you hit him, and then just come back here to me." The maiden found everything exactly as the old woman had said, and on her way back she found her two brothers, who had sought each other over half the world. They went together to the place where the black dog was lying on the road. She struck it in the face, and it turned into a handsome prince who went with them to the river. There the old woman was standing. She rejoiced much to see them again, and carried them all over the water, and then she too went away, for now she was freed. The others, however, went to the old fisherman, and all were glad that they had found each other again, but they hung the bird on the wall. But the second son could not settle at home, and took his crossbow and went a-hunting. When he was tired, he took his flute and made music. The king was hunting too, and heard that, and went thither. And when he met the youth, he said, "Who has given thee leave to hunt here?" "Oh, no one." "To whom dost thou belong, then?" "I am the fisherman's son." "But he has no children." "If thou wilt not believe, come with me." That the king did, and questioned the fisherman, who told him everything to him. And the little bird on the wall began to sing. The mother sits alone, there in the prison small. O king of royal blood, these are thy children all. The sisters twain, so false, they wrought the children woe. There in the waters deep, where the fishermen come and go. Then they were all terrified, and the king took the bird, the fisherman, and the 3 children back with him to the castle, and ordered the prison to be opened, and brought his wife out again. She had, however, grown quite ill and weak. Then the daughter gave her some of the water by the fountain to drink, and she became strong and healthy. But the 2 false sisters were burnt, and the daughter married the prince. The water of life. There was once a king who had an illness, and no one believed that he would come out of it with his life. He had 3 sons who were much distressed about it, and went down into the palace garden and wept. There they met an old man who inquired as to the cause of their grief. They told him that their father was so ill that he would most certainly die, for nothing seemed to cure him. Then the old man said, "I know of one more remedy, and that is the water of life. If he drinks of it, he will become well again, but it is hard to find." The eldest said, "I will manage to find it," and went to the sick king, and begged to be allowed to go forth in search of the water of life, for that alone could save him. "No," said the king, "the danger of it is too great. I would rather die." But he begged so long that the king consented. The prince thought in his heart, "If I bring the water, then I shall be best beloved of my father, and shall inherit the kingdom." So he set out, and when he had ridden forth a little distance, a dwarf stood there in the road, who called to him and said, "Whither away so fast?" "Silly shrimp," said the prince very haughtily, "it has nothing to do with you," and rode on. But the little dwarf had grown angry, and had wished an evil wish. Soon after this the prince entered a ravine, and the further he rode, the closer the mountains drew together. And at last the road became so narrow that he could not advance a step further. It was impossible either to turn his horse or to dismount from the saddle, and as he was shut in there as if he was in prison. The sick king waited long for him, but he came not. Then the second son said, "Father, let me go forth to seek the water," and thought to himself, "If my brother is dead, then the kingdom will fall to me." At first the king would not allow him to go either, but at last he yielded, so the prince set out on the same road that his brother had taken, and he too met the dwarf, who stopped him to ask whither he was going in such a haste. "Little shrimp," said the prince, that is nothing to thee," and rode on without giving him another look. But the dwarf bewitched him, and he, like the other, rode into a ravine, and could neither go forwards nor backwards, so fare haughty people. As the second son also remained away, the youngest begged to be allowed to go forth to fetch the water, and at last the king was obliged to let him go. When he met the dwarf, and the latter asked him whither he was going in such a haste, he stopped, gave him an explanation, and said, "I am seeking the water of life, for my father is sick unto death." "Dost thou know, then, where that is to be found?" "No," said the prince. "As thou hast borne thyself as is seemly, and not haughtily like thy false brothers, I will give thee the information, and tell thee how thou mayest obtain the water of life. It springs from a fountain in the courtyard of an enchanted castle, but thou wilt not be able to make thy way to it, if I do not give thee an iron wand and 2 small loaves of bread. Strike thrice with the wand on the iron door of the castle, and it will spring open. Inside lie 2 lions with gaping jaws, but if thou throwest a loaf to each of them, they will be quieted. Then hasten to fetch some of the water of life before the clock strikes 12, else the door will shut again, and thou wilt be imprisoned." The prince thanked him, took the wand and the bread, and set out of his way. When he arrived, everything was as the dwarf had said. The door sprang open at the 3rd stroke of the wand, and when he had appeased the lion with the bread, he entered the castle and came to a large and splendid hall, wherein sat some enchanted princes whose rings he drew off their fingers. A sword and a loaf of bread were lying there, which she carried away. After this he entered a chamber, in which was a beautiful maiden who rejoiced when she saw him, kissed him, and told him that he had delivered her, and should have the whole of her kingdom, and that if he would return in a year, their wedding should be celebrated. Likewise, she told him where the spring of the water of life was, and that he was to hasten and draw some of it before the clock struck 12. Then he went onwards, and at last entered a room where there was a beautiful newly made bed, and as he was very weary, he felt inclined to rest a little, so he lay down and fell asleep. When he awoke, it was striking 11:45. He sprang up in a fright, ran to the spring, drew some water in a cup which stood near, and hastened away. But just as he was passing through the iron door, the clock struck 12, and the door fell to with such violence that it carried away a piece of his heel. He, however, rejoicing at having obtained the water of life, went homewards, and again passed the dwarf. When the latter saw the sword and the loaf, he said, "With these thou hast won great wealth. With the sword thou canst slay whole armies, and the bread will never come to an end." But the prince would not go home to his father without his brothers, and said, "Dear dwarf, canst thou not tell me where my 2 brothers are? They went out before I did in search of the water of life, and have not returned." "They are imprisoned between 2 mountains," said the dwarf. "I have condemned them to stay there because they were so haughty." Then the prince begged until the dwarf released them. But he warned him, however, and said, "Beware of them, for they have bad hearts." When his brothers came, he rejoiced, and told them how things had gone with him, that he had found the water of life, and had brought a cupful away with him, and had rescued a beautiful princess, who was willing to wait a year for him, and when their wedding was to be celebrated, and he would obtain a great kingdom. After that they rode on together, and chanced upon a land where war and famine reigned, and the king already thought he must perish, for the scarcity was so great. Then the prince went to him, and gave him the loaf, wherewith he fed and satisfied the whole of his kingdom, and then the prince gave him the sword, also wherewith he slew the host of his enemies, and could now live in rest in peace. The prince then took back his loaf and sword, and the 3 brothers rode on. But after this, they entered 2 more countries where war and famine reigned, and each time the prince gave his loaf and his sword to the kings, and had now delivered 3 kingdoms, and after that they went on board a ship, and sailed over the sea. During the passage, the 2 eldest brothers conversed apart, and said, "The youngest has found the water of life, and not we, for that our father will give him the kingdom which belongs to us, and he will rob us of all our fortune." They then began to seek revenge, and plotted with each other to destroy him. They waited until they found him fast asleep, then they poured the water of life out of the cup, and took it for themselves. But into the cup they poured salt sea water. Now, therefore, when they arrived home, the youngest took his cup to the sick king in order that he might drink out of it, and be cured. But scarcely had he drunk a very little of the salt sea water, then he became still worse than before. And as he was lamenting over this, the 2 eldest brothers came and accused the youngest of having intended to poison him, and said that they had brought him the true water of life, and handed it to him. He had scarcely tasted it when he felt his sickness departing, and became strong and healthy as in the days of his youth. After that they both went to the youngest, mocked him, and said, "You certainly found the water of life, but you have had the pain, and we the gain. You should have been sharper, and should have kept your eyes open. We took it from you whilst you were asleep at sea, and when a year is over, one of us will go and fetch the beautiful princess. But beware that you do not disclose aught of this to our father. Indeed, he does not trust you, and if you say a single word, you shall lose your life into the bargain. But if you keep silent, you shall have it as a gift." The old king was angry with his youngest son, and thought he had plotted against his life. So he summoned the court together, and had sentence pronounced upon his son, that he should be secretly shot. And once, when the prince was riding forth to the chase, suspecting no evil, the king's huntsman had to go with him. And when they were quite alone in the forest, the huntsman looked so sorrowful that the prince said to him, "Dear huntsman, what ails you?" The huntsman said, "I cannot tell you, and yet I ought." Then the prince said, "Say openly what it is. I will pardon you." "Alas," said the huntsman, "I am to shoot you dead. The king has ordered me to do it." Then the prince was shocked and said, "Dear huntsman, let me live. There, I give you my royal garments. Give me your common ones in their stead." The huntsman said, "I will willingly do that. Indeed, I should not have been able to shoot you." Then they exchanged clothes, and the huntsman returned home. The prince, however, went further into the forest. After a time, 3 wagons of gold and precious stones came to the king for his youngest son, which were sent by the 3 kings who had slain their enemies with the prince's sword, and maintained their people with his bread, and who wished to show their gratitude for it. The old king then thought, "Can my son have been innocent?" and said to his people, "Would that he were still alive! How it grieves me that I have suffered him to be killed!" "He still lives," said the huntsman. "I cannot find it in my heart to carry out your command," and told the king how it had happened. Then a stone fell from the king's heart, and he had it proclaimed in every country that his son might return and be taken into favor again. The princess, however, had a road made up to her palace, which was quite bright and golden, and told her people that whosoever came riding straight along it to her would be the right wooer, and was to be admitted, and whoever rode by the side of it was not the right one, and was not to be admitted. As the time was now close at hand, the eldest thought he would hasten to go to the king's daughter, and give himself out as her deliverer, and thus win her for his bride and the kingdom to boot. Therefore he rode forth, and when he arrived in front of the palace and saw the splendid golden road, he thought it would be a sin and a shame if he were to ride over that, and turned aside and rode on the right side of it. But when he came to the door, the servants told him that he was not the right man, and was to go away again. Soon after this, the second prince set out, and when he came to the golden road, and his horse had put 1 foot on it, he thought it would be a sin and a shame to tread a piece of it off, and he turned aside and rode on the left side of it. And when he reached the door, the attendants told him he was not the right one, and he was to go away again. When at last the year had entirely expired, the third son likewise wished to ride out of the forest to his beloved, and with her forget his sorrows. So he set out and thought of her so incessantly, and wished to be with her so much, that he never noticed the golden road at all. So his horse rode onwards up the middle of it, and when he came to the door it was opened, and the princess received him with joy, and said he was her deliverer, and the lord of the kingdom, and their wedding was celebrated with great rejoicing. When it was over, she told him that his father invited him to come to him, and had forgiven him. So he rode thither and told him everything, how his brothers had betrayed him, and how he had nevertheless kept silent. The old king wished to punish them, but they had put to sea and never came back as long as they lived.